The Black Cross did not come to the Baltic as a legend. It came through fog. It came over frozen rivers, past dark forests, toward timber villages and stone fortresses raised against the cold. Banners moved where the northern wind cut through mail and wool. Men called it crusade. Others called it invasion. And this is where the story must be corrected at once. This is not really a wandering tale of the Templars. The true feud was older, colder, and far more local, the Teutonic order against the peoples of the Baltic. To follow it, we have to leave behind the familiar roads to Jerusalem. No sun-burned desert, no distant holy sepulchre. Here, the frontier was made of marshland, pine resin, winter smoke, and rivers that could become roads when the ice hardened enough to carry armies. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. In the north, history does not always announce itself with marble ruins or golden relics. Sometimes it waits in place names, in broken castle walls, in chronicles written by victors, and in the stubborn survival of peoples who were supposed to disappear. The Teutonic Knights were the language of salvation, but they also built roads, collected taxes, raised fortresses, and carved authority into land that had never asked for them. To understand the Black Cross over the Baltic, we must look past the romance of crusading orders and into the long struggle beneath it. A war for belief, power, memory, and survival. When most people hear the word crusade, the mind travels south. It imagines heat, stone cities, long roads through Anatolia and Syria, armies moving toward Jerusalem beneath a white sun. The story feels almost fixed in place, as if crusading belonged naturally to the Eastern Mediterranean, to desert fortresses and holy tombs, to the old struggle between Latin Christendom and the Islamic powers of the Near East. But the Baltic forces us to turn the map around. Here, crusade meant something different. It moved not through olive groves or dry plains, but through forests so thick that an army could vanish inside them. It moved across wetlands, river mouths, frozen tracks, and narrow paths known better to local scouts than to foreign knights. It moved through a world where distance was not measured only in miles, but in mud, hunger, weather, and the risk of stepping beyond the reach of your own fortifications. This was not Jerusalem. There was no single sacred city waiting at the end of the march. No one destination that could be captured and held up as proof that heaven had smiled on the campaign. The Baltic Crusade was scattered, repetitive, and grinding. It was made of raids, counter-raids, burned settlements, rebuilt strongholds, hostage-taking, conversions, rebellions, and negotiated submissions that often failed to last. Victory was rarely clean. Defeat was rarely final. And that is one of the first things that makes this frontier so easy to misunderstand. From far away, the Baltic Wars can look like a simple extension of Christian Europe. German crusaders moving east and north, pagan peoples being subdued, castles rising, churches planted, territories absorbed into a new order. A neat, almost administrative story. Up close, it was nothing like that. It was a war fought among people who knew the land intimately, against men who tried to make the land legible through castles, charters, roads, and commanderies. It was a collision between different ways of organizing power. The Crusaders often understood conquest through legal documents and papal language. The local peoples understood survival through kinship, fortified villages, seasonal mobility, sacred places, and the ability to retreat into terrain that refused to cooperate with invaders. The forest was not scenery, it was strategy. Marshland could slow an army until its supplies collapsed. Rivers could divide territory or, in winter, suddenly join it. A frozen river might become a highway for mounted men one month and a death trap the next. A village that looked vulnerable in one season might be almost unreachable in another. For the Teutonic order and the Crusaders who came before them, the Baltic was not simply a place to conquer. It was a place that had to be learned, mapped, fortified, and repeatedly punished into obedience for the peoples already living there. It was home. That word matters. Home is too often missing from crusading narratives. Chroniclers liked to write about conversion, rebellion, divine judgment, and the courage of Christian warriors. They were less interested in what it meant for Prussian, Livonian, Semigallian, Samogitian, or Lithuanian communities to watch armed foreigners arrive with priests, banners, and claims of sacred authority. The sources we have are often tilted toward the men who wrote them, and most of those men wrote from the Crusader side. So we have to read carefully, not suspiciously for its own sake, but carefully. Because when a chronicle says a village was pacified, we have to ask what that meant on the ground. Did it mean baptism, tribute, hostages, a new lord, a destroyed shrine, a forced relocation, a castle built nearby to ensure the submission remained useful? Did it mean genuine acceptance of a new religious order, or a practical decision made under pressure, with rebellion waiting for the right winter? The Baltic Crusade was a religious war, but it was never only a religious war. That is another point worth holding on to early. The language of salvation was real. Many crusaders believed deeply in the spiritual value of what they were doing. Papal approval mattered. Preaching mattered. The promise of indulgence mattered. Medieval people were not pretending to be religious as a cover for politics. Faith shaped how they saw the world. But faith did not march alone. Behind the cross came land hunger, noble ambition, trade routes, taxation, settlement, and the hard logic of permanent control. A crusade in the Holy Land might end with a pilgrimage fulfilled or a temporary expedition completed. In the Baltic, crusading became a way to build a frontier state. Holy war did not just pass through. It settled down, collected rents, and built walls. That made the conflict unusually intimate. The enemy was not far away across a sea. The enemy lived beyond the next river, in the next forest district, near the next trade route. The order could not simply win one glorious battle and go home. Its survival depended on expanding, defending, administering, and justifying itself year after year. And for the Baltic peoples, resistance was not an abstract defense of old gods against new doctrine. It was a defense of autonomy, family networks, burial grounds, tribute systems, and the right not to be reorganized by outsiders who arrived speaking the language of eternity while demanding very earthly obedience. There is a bleak honesty in that contradiction. The Crusaders claimed to fight for souls. They also needed grain, horses, timber, tolls, and secure roads. They preached conversion, but they built castles in places where preaching alone had failed. They spoke of pagan darkness, but their opponents were not shadows in the trees. They were diplomats, raiders, chiefs, warriors, farmers, and survivors. They adapted. They made alliances. They exploited crusader weakness. They sometimes accepted baptism when it was useful, and sometimes returned to older loyalties when the pressure lifted. The Baltic frontier was not a blank edge of civilization. It was a contested world, and perhaps that is why the story feels colder than the familiar crusading myths. Not because the people were more brutal than others in the Middle Ages. Brutality was not in short supply anywhere. But because this war was so persistent, it did not burn brightly and vanish. It became part of the political weather. Generation after generation grew up inside it, inheriting fear, grievance, obligation, and the memory of earlier violence. In the South, the dream of Jerusalem gave crusading its great symbol. In the North, there was no single city bright enough to contain the meaning of the war. Instead, meaning gathered around smaller things: a burned stronghold, a baptized chief, a winter raid, a treaty broken under pressure, a castle razed where an older sacred landscape had stood, a road cut through forest so soldiers could return faster next time. The Baltic Crusade was not a detour from the story of medieval Europe. It was one of the places where medieval Europe was being made by force, and the Teutonic Order, more than any other crusading institution in the region, would learn how to turn that force into a system. The Teutonic Order did not begin as a northern power. Its origins lay far from the Baltic forests, in the world of crusader hospitals, siege camps, and Mediterranean war. Like the Templars and the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights belonged to that strange medieval category, where monk and soldier were folded into one life. They took religious vows. They lived under discipline. They carried weapons. To modern ears, this combination can sound almost impossible, but in the crusading imagination, it made a severe kind of sense. Violence, properly authorized, could be treated as service. That idea would travel. By the early 13th century, the order was searching for something more durable than scattered privileges and battlefield usefulness. In the Holy Land, crusader power was fragile. In Europe, noble families, princes, bishops, and emperors all competed for influence. A military order needed patrons, land, legitimacy, and a reason to keep existing. The Baltic offered all four. It was not simply that the Teutonic Knights looked north and saw pagans to convert. That was part of it, and an important part in the language of the age. But what they also saw was a frontier where spiritual warfare could become territorial rule, a place where papal blessing and imperial support might allow them to do something rare: build a state of their own. This is the point where the story becomes more than a campaign. A crusading expedition can fail, return, or dissolve. A state has memory. A state builds offices. A state measures fields, grants land, stores grain, collects revenue, and punishes disobedience even when no great battle is being fought. The Teutonic orders turned toward the Baltic mattered because it transformed crusading from an event into an institution. The sword did not merely open the road, it stayed to guard the toll gate. The invitation into Prussia came through a familiar medieval problem. One ruler's frontier was another ruler's opportunity. The pagan Prussians, living along the southeastern Baltic, had resisted Christian expansion and posed a threat to neighboring Christian territories, especially those ruled or claimed by Polish powers. Duke Conrad of Mazovia sought help against them, and the Teutonic Order was willing to answer, but not as temporary hired muscle. The Order wanted guarantees. It wanted rights that would survive the moment. It wanted legal foundations strong enough to turn military assistance into sovereignty. Here, paperwork mattered almost as much as armor. That may feel less cinematic than banners in the snow, but it is one of the keys to the entire Baltic story. The Teutonic Order understood that conquest needed documents. Charters, privileges, papal confirmations, and imperial grants could turn a contested occupation into something that looked lawful in the eyes of Latin Christendom. Before castles dominated the landscape, claims dominated parchment. This does not mean the documents were simple or uncontested. Medieval grants often overlapped, contradicted one another, or became weapons in later arguments. The evidence around some early promises and confirmations has been debated by historians, especially where the Order's later power made its own version of events very convenient. But the broader pattern is clear enough. The Teutonic Knights moved into the Baltic not only as crusaders, but as legal architects of their own future. They were careful about authority. Papal approval gave the war a sacred frame. It allowed campaigns against Baltic pagans to be preached as crusades, attaching spiritual reward to northern violence. Imperial backing gave the order another kind of legitimacy, tying its claims to the political world of the Holy Roman Empire. Local rulers could open the door, but Pope and Emperor helped make the order harder to remove once it stepped through. And once it stepped through, it did not behave like an army passing across someone else's battlefield. It began to build. The Prussian campaigns were long and brutal, and they cannot be reduced to one dramatic arrival. The order advanced through a pattern that became grimly practical. Establish a fortified position, secure routes, attract settlers, pressure nearby communities, punish resistance, negotiate submission, then push forward again. Castles were not decorations. They were machines of occupation. A castle could shelter mounted brothers and sergeants, store supplies, intimidate surrounding districts, and serve as a visible promise that the invaders intended to return. The Baltic landscape was teaching the order a lesson. In this world, control had to be local, physical, and repeated. A victory in open battle was useful, but a fortress changed the rhythm of daily life. It meant patrols, it meant taxation, it meant a place where hostages could be kept and disputes judged according to foreign law. It meant that the crusade had acquired an address. That is what made the Teutonic Order so dangerous to its Baltic enemies. It was not merely brave, fanatical, or well-armed, although its warriors could be all of those things. Its real strength was organizational. It could connect distant donors to local campaigns. It could bring in knights from across German lands for seasonal crusading. It could manage settlement, diplomacy, supply, and war under one disciplined corporate identity. Individual nobles might die, quarrel, or lose interest. The order endured. There is a cold genius in that endurance. A noble lord might think in terms of inheritance. A bishop might think in terms of a diocese. A merchant might think in terms of ports and profit. The Teutonic order learned to think in all these languages at once while presenting itself as a servant of God. That combination made it difficult to categorize and even harder to confront. Was it a monastery, an army, a landholder, a government, a crusading machine? In the Baltic, it became all of them. This is why comparing the Teutonic Knights too closely with the Templars can mislead us. The Templars became famous for their role in the Holy Land, their wealth, their secrecy in the imagination of later centuries, and their dramatic destruction in the early 14th century. The Teutonic Order's northern story is different. Its power did not rest mainly on mystery or legend. It rested on administration. It survived by becoming territorial, practical, and deeply embedded in the politics of the Baltic. The Black Cross was not only worn on cloaks, it appeared in seals, documents, castle chapels, town privileges, and military obligations. It became the emblem of a system that could bless a raid in the morning and record a tax obligation in the afternoon. That mixture of devotion and bureaucracy may seem almost dull beside the romance of crusading, but it is exactly where the darker significance lies. Violence becomes more permanent when it learns to file records. For the Prussians and other Baltic peoples, this meant they were not facing a single invasion that might be survived by waiting out one army. They were facing an institution designed to remember defeat and return with a plan. Each crusading season could become part of a longer strategy. Each castle could serve the next campaign. Each baptism, whether sincere, coerced, or politically necessary, could be used to redraw obligations. The Order's northern kingdom was not born in one moment. It emerged from invitation, ambition, religious sanction, legal maneuvering, and relentless force. Its founders and patrons may have spoken in the high language of holy war, but what took shape in Prussia and beyond was unmistakably political. A crusade had found soil deep enough to root itself, and once it did, the people in the forest would have to decide how much they were willing to lose before they surrendered. To the Crusader chroniclers, the peoples of the Baltic often appear first as a problem. They are described as pagans, rebels, raiders, obstacles to the spread of Christian rule. Sometimes they are grouped together so loosely that the landscape seems full of one undifferentiated enemy, a dark mass beyond the frontier. That is convenient writing for a crusading source. It gives the war a cleaner shape. It makes invasions sound like correction. But the deeper you look, the more that simplicity falls apart. The Prussians were not the Livonians. The Livonians were not the Semi-Gallians. The Semi-Gallians were not the Samogitians. The Samogitians were not the Lithuanians. Each group had its own local power structures, loyalties, customs, rivalries, and strategies of survival. They were not waiting passively in the forest for history to arrive on horseback. They were already part of history, with trade contacts, political ambitions, spiritual worlds, and military habits of their own. That distinction matters because conquest often begins with flattening. Before a people can be ruled, they are usually simplified. Their gods become superstition. Their leaders become bandits. Their refusal becomes stubbornness rather than politics. Their land becomes a frontier, as if it only gains meaning once outsiders mark it on a map. In the Baltic, that simplification was not just a misunderstanding, it was useful. It helped crusaders explain why violence against entire communities could be presented as a holy duty. The Prussians stood at the center of the order's earliest northern ambitions. They occupied lands along the southeastern Baltic, in a region of river systems, forests, and coastal approaches that mattered to Polish rulers, German settlers, merchants, bishops, and crusaders. To the Teutonic order, Prussia was both mission field and foundation. If the order could conquer it, secure it, and reorganize it, then the Northern Crusade would no longer depend only on temporary campaigns. It would have a base, but the Prussians were not a single centralized kingdom that could be defeated by capturing one capital. Their strength and vulnerability both came from a more fragmented world. Local elites could submit, resist, bargain, or reverse course. One district might make terms while another prepared for war. A baptism could signal acceptance, diplomacy, pressure, or temporary survival, depending on the circumstances. The order wanted clear obedience. The Prussian world often gave it ambiguity, and ambiguity is difficult to govern. Further north and east were the peoples whose names would become tied to some of the hardest fighting of the Baltic Crusades. The Livonians lived in regions connected to the lower Daugava and the Gulf of Riga, where river trade and missionary ambition met early. Their world was drawn into crusading conflict before the Teutonic order became dominant, through the efforts of bishops, merchants, and the military order known as the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. The Semi-Gallians, positioned in what is now broadly associated with parts of Latvia and Lithuania, became known for fierce and prolonged resistance. Their lands were not merely an empty corridor between stronger powers. They occupied a strategic zone, and that made them dangerous. A frontier people with access to difficult terrain and regional alliances could frustrate crusader plans for years. The chroniclers might record them as enemies of Christian order, but from another angle they were defending the right to remain outside someone else's order. Then there were the Samogitians. Their name returns again and again, because geography made them impossible to ignore. Samogitia lay between the Teutonic Order's Prussian territories and its Livonian branch to the north. As long as Samogitia remained outside the Order's control, the Teutonic world in the Baltic was divided. Prussia and Livonia could communicate, cooperate, and campaign, but never with the smoothness that a continuous land bridge would have provided. Samogitia was not just another resistant region. It was a wedge in the Order's dream of territorial coherence. That is why the Order became so fixated on it. A map can make this obvious in a way a chronicle sometimes hides. For the Order, Samogitia was the stubborn piece that refused to fit. For the Samogitians and their allies, that same stubbornness became a form of power. They did not need to defeat the Teutonic Order everywhere. They needed, again and again, to deny it the one thing it craved, uninterrupted control, and beyond them all stood Lithuania. At first glance, Lithuania might seem like another frontier target, another pagan land marked for eventual conversion and conquest. But that reading collapses quickly. Lithuania became something larger and more alarming to the Crusaders. A political power capable not only of resistance, but of expansion. It could raid. It could negotiate. It could absorb pressure and return it. It could exploit rivalries among Christian powers. It could treat the Teutonic Order not as an unstoppable agent of history, but as one dangerous neighbor among many. This was the Order's nightmare taking shape slowly. A small community can be terrorized. A fortified district can be besieged. A local leader can be pressured into baptism or alliance. But a rising Grand Duchy changes the scale of the conflict. Lithuania could give refuge, support rebellions, launch counterattacks, and turn the Baltic Crusade into a war between political systems rather than a one-way process of conversion. This is where the phrase, enemies in the forest, needs to be handled carefully. It can sound like the Crusaders were entering a wilderness populated by mysterious tribes, and that is exactly the atmosphere many medieval writers helped create. But forests were not the opposite of civilization. They were lived-in environments. They contained routes, hunting grounds, sacred places, defensive refuges, and economic resources. To outsiders, a forest could look like confusion. To locals, it could be a map. The Baltic peoples used that map. They fought in ways suited to their world. They knew when to retreat, when to strike, when to avoid heavy cavalry, when to use rivers, swamps, and seasonal change. They built and defended fortified sites. They formed alliances when necessary and broke them when survival required it. They also fought each other, made compromises, and sometimes cooperated with crusaders against rivals. We should not romanticize them into a perfect united resistance. They were human communities under pressure, not symbols carved from oak. That human complexity is important. The story loses something if we imagine noble pagans on one side and cruel crusaders on the other, as if history can be made morally clear by reversing the old propaganda. The Teutonic Order was capable of harsh conquest and coercive rule. The Baltic peoples were capable of violence, raiding, and political calculation. But the imbalance lay in the structure of the conflict. One side arrived with an ideology that justified permanent expansion into another people's land. The other side was forced to decide how to survive that arrival. For many, survival meant adaptation. Some accepted baptism, whether out of conviction, convenience, exhaustion, or necessity. Some entered the order's new legal and economic world. Some became intermediaries. Some rebelled after submission when the burdens of foreign rule became unbearable. Others withdrew toward powers still capable of resisting. Identity in this frontier was not always a fixed banner held proudly from beginning to end. It could be negotiated under fear, reshaped by marriage, hostage-taking, tribute, opportunity, and loss. That does not make the conflict softer. It makes it more real. A blood feud is not sustained only by hatred. It is sustained by memory. A killed relative, a burned settlement, a forced oath. A winter campaign remembered in one family and celebrated in another. A castle built where people once moved freely. A converted chief whose authority now came from foreign backing. A child raised under a new order that their grandparents had fought to keep away. The Teutonic Knights saw enemies in the forest, but those enemies saw something too. Men who came bearing crosses, documents, and iron, insisting that their arrival had already been approved in heaven. Between those two visions, the Baltic Wars found their terrible endurance. before the Teutonic Order became the great black-crossed power of the Baltic. The frontier had already learned the sound of crusading war. The Northern Crusade did not begin with one clean institutional handover, as if a banner was lowered and another raised in its place. It began messier than that. Merchants moved along rivers. Missionaries followed trade routes. Bishops looked for converts and authority. Local rulers calculated advantage. German settlers, armed pilgrims, and ambitious nobles entered a region where conversion, commerce, and conquest were already becoming tangled together. The Teutonic Knights would inherit a battlefield that had been prepared by others. The most important of those earlier crusading forces was the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. Their name sounds almost too perfect for a medieval war order, as if it had been invented by a novelist with a taste for iron and doom. But their role was very real. Founded in the early 13th century, they were meant to protect and expand the Christian mission in Livonia, especially around the growing center of Riga and the lower Daugava. In theory, they served the cause of conversion. In practice, they became one of the armed engines of German expansion into the eastern Baltic. That distinction is not a modern insult. It is the structure of the story. Missionary work in the Baltic had a problem. Preaching alone did not create stable obedience. A baptism could be accepted and later abandoned. A local leader might cooperate when threatened and resist once the threat moved elsewhere. A community might tolerate foreign priests but reject foreign rule. For crusading authorities, this was interpreted as rebellion against Christian order. For local peoples, it may often have looked like refusal to let ritual submission become permanent subordination. So the frontier hardened. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword fought not in the open landscapes of heroic paintings, but in a zone of rivers, timber strongholds, seasonal roads, and shifting alliances. Their campaigns were tied to bishops, towns, merchants, and crusading reinforcements from the German lands. Riga became a base of mission and power, but also a place where interests collided. The bishop wanted authority. The knights wanted land and rights. Merchants wanted security and access. Local peoples wanted to survive the arrival of all three. This was not a simple story of Christians advancing together in perfect unity. Even among the Crusaders, there were rivalries. Bishops and military brothers could quarrel over jurisdiction, tribute, conquered territories, and who had the right to command. The language of holy war did not remove the ordinary medieval appetite for control. If anything, it gave those appetites a sacred vocabulary. A dispute over land could be dressed in the language of mission. A political defeat could be mourned as a setback for Christendom. The border between devotion and ambition was not always visible, even to the people crossing it. And the local peoples understood those divisions. Livonians, Letts, Estonians, Semi-Gallians, and others did not face one perfectly coordinated machine. They faced a coalition of outsiders and converted allies that could be dangerous but also unstable. Some local groups allied with crusaders against old rivals. Others resisted fiercely. Some shifted between submission and revolt, depending on pressure, opportunity, and the reliability of promises made to them. This was not hypocrisy. It was frontier politics under threat. To survive, people used whatever tools remained. The Brothers of the Sword were never as secure as later legend might suggest. They were aggressive, but vulnerable. Their numbers were limited. Their authority depended on reinforcement, intimidation, fortification, and the ability to make examples. When they won, they could appear as the sharp edge of a divine project. When they lost, the thinness of the crusading presence was suddenly exposed. This is one of the strange features of the Baltic Wars. Power could look overwhelming from a chronicle and dangerously fragile on the ground. A castle might dominate the surrounding countryside, but only as far as its garrison, supplies, and allies could reach. A newly converted district might seem pacified until a neighboring people rose in arms. A crusader army might ride out confidently and then find itself trapped by terrain it did not fully understand. The frontier punished arrogance. It punished hesitation too. Neither side had the luxury of imagining war as clean. The violence that developed before Teutonic dominance set patterns that would last for generations. Raiding became normal. Retaliation became expected. Fortified sites changed hands or were destroyed. Communities were baptized, taxed, pressured, and sometimes driven back into revolt. Each side learned to read the other. Crusaders learned that conversion without military control could be temporary. Local peoples learned that submission could be used as a pause, not necessarily an ending. The result was a world in which peace often meant only that the next campaign had not yet begun. It is tempting to treat the Livonian Brothers of the Sword as a failed prologue to the Teutonic Order, a smaller and rougher experiment before the larger institution arrived. There is some truth in that, but it is too neat. The Sword Brothers shaped the battlefield in ways that mattered deeply. They helped establish the idea that the Eastern Baltic could be a crusading zone. They tied military conquest to episcopal and urban expansion. They made enemies, allies, and precedents. They proved that armed religious orders could become political actors in the region. They also proved how badly such an order could overreach. The northern frontier was not passive. It could absorb pressure and then answer. Semi-Gallians, Samogitians, Lithuanians, and others were not simply names on the edge of Christian maps. They were watching the crusading project develop. They were learning its methods, and when the Sword Brothers pushed too far into hostile terrain, they would discover that sacred confidence did not make steel lighter, horses stronger, or marshland more forgiving. The older violence of Livonia gave the Teutonic Order both an inheritance and a warning. The inheritance was practical. Castles, claims, conflicts, routes, enemies, and a crusading language already familiar to Western supporters. The warning was harder to accept. The Baltic could break a military order that mistook momentum for mastery. This is where the coming story tightens. The Teutonic Order did not enter an empty stage. It entered a war already thick with resentment. Local peoples had already seen priests arrive with soldiers behind them. They had already seen promises tied to tribute and baptism, tied to obedience. They had already learned that the cross could be carried by men who intended to rule. So when the Black Cross of the Teutonic Order came deeper into the northern conflict, it did not appear as a neutral force of reform. It arrived carrying the unfinished grudges of the frontier. There are battles that matter because of what they decide. And then there are battles that matter because of what they reveal. Saul in 1236 belongs to the second kind. It did not end the Baltic Crusades. It did not free the entire frontier from crusading pressure. It did not stop the advance of Latin Christendom into the north, but it tore open a weakness that the Crusaders preferred not to see. The men who carried the cross into the Baltic could be surrounded, broken, and remembered not as conquerors, but as the defeated. The exact location of the battle has been debated, and the surviving accounts do not give us the clean detail that a modern military historian might wish for. This is common in medieval warfare. Chroniclers were often more interested in moral meaning than tactical precision. They wanted to explain why God had allowed victory or disaster, not provide a field map. So we should be careful. We know enough to see the shape of the catastrophe, but not enough to pretend we can watch every movement across the ground. What can be said with confidence is that the Livonian brothers of the sword marched into danger and did not come out intact. They had gone campaigning against pagan opponents, most often associated with the Samogitians and their allies. The campaign was part of the same brutal frontier rhythm: strike into hostile territory, punish resistance, seize plunder if possible, return with prestige, and prove that the crusading project still had force behind it. But the frontier did not reward confidence simply because it wore armor. The Crusader army found itself in hostile country, burdened by conditions that favored local fighters. Heavy cavalry, so powerful on suitable ground, could become awkward in marshland and broken terrain. Retreat could become confusion. A disciplined advance could turn into a desperate attempt to escape. The Baltic landscape, so often described by outsiders as a wilderness, became an ally to those who understood it. Saul was not merely a clash of weapons, it was a clash between assumptions. The Sword Brothers and their crusading companions assumed that a campaign could project terror into enemy land and return with authority strengthened. Their opponents understood that such armies could be watched, delayed, harassed, and forced into a place where their advantages narrowed. When battle came, the result was devastating for the order. Many of its brothers were killed, including its master, Vulquin. That detail matters. The death of a leader in medieval war could carry a meaning larger than the loss of one man. A master embodied continuity, discipline, and divine purpose. When he fell with many of his brothers, the defeat became more than military. It became symbolic. The Sword Brothers had not simply lost men. They had lost the illusion that their order could dominate the frontier through aggression alone. For the Baltic peoples resisting Crusader expansion, Saul offered a different lesson. The enemy could bleed. That may sound obvious, but in a world of fortified towns, imported knights, papal preaching, and relentless pressure, the psychological weight of victory mattered. Crusading orders relied not only on arms, but on aura. They needed to appear as instruments of a larger destiny. Their banners, vows, and privileges helped make their wars seem inevitable. A disaster like Saul interrupted that inevitability. It told local communities that resistance was not only honorable, but practical. Of course, we should not turn the battle into a simple national myth before nations existed in the modern sense. Later memory has often reshaped medieval conflicts into cleaner stories of peoples rising together against invaders. The reality was more tangled. Alliances shifted. Identities were local and layered. Some groups cooperated with crusaders. Others fought them. Even so, Saul clearly entered the long memory of the region because it exposed the vulnerability of a crusading order at a critical moment. It also created a crisis among the crusaders themselves. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword had already been operating in a difficult and unstable world. Their relations with bishops and local powers were not always smooth. Their resources were limited. Their enemies were adaptive. After Saul, the order was badly weakened. It could no longer pretend to be a secure, independent force capable of managing the Northern Crusade on its own terms. The defeat raised a hard question. What should happen to a crusading order that had failed so publicly? In another setting, such a collapse might have led to disappearance, reform, or absorption by a stronger institution. In the Baltic, the answer would be absorption. The surviving sword brothers were drawn into the Teutonic order, whose larger structure, broader prestige, and stronger political connections could stabilize what remained of the Livonian crusading project. But this solution came with a cost. When the Teutonic order inherited the remains of the sword brothers, it did not inherit a peaceful mission field. It inherited a wound. It inherited unresolved wars, resentful local populations, contested authority, and the memory of a defeat that both frightened crusaders and emboldened their enemies. Saul became the kind of event that changes the tone of a frontier. After it, the question was no longer whether armed orders could be defeated. They had been defeated. The question was whether a stronger order could learn from the disaster and make the next stage of conquest more permanent. That is where the true importance of Saul lies. It was not the end of crusading power in the Baltic. If anything, it helped clear the way for a more formidable version of that power. The failure of the Sword Brothers made room for the Teutonic order to step deeper into Livonia, bringing with it a more developed institutional mind. The Black Cross did not arrive simply because the North was open. It arrived because the earlier crusading structure had been damaged badly enough to need rescue. There is a bitter pattern here. A victory for Baltic resistance weakened one enemy, but helped invite a stronger one. This does not make the victory meaningless. Far from it. Saul remained significant because it showed that the crusading frontier was not a one-way road. It showed that local fighters could shape the strategic future of the region. The Sword Brothers did not vanish because of administrative tidiness. They vanished because war had exposed their limits. In the years that followed, the Teutonic order would present itself as disciplined, durable, and divinely sanctioned. It would build more efficiently, govern more systematically, and fight with the memory of earlier failure somewhere behind its eyes. But the peoples of the Baltic had their own memory too. They had seen an order fall in the mud and confusion of the northern frontier, and that memory would not be easy to bury. The fall of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword did not leave an empty space. Medieval frontiers rarely allow emptiness to last. Too many interests press in. Bishops still wanted authority. Merchants still wanted safe routes. German nobles still wanted crusading prestige. Rome still wanted the conversion and control of the Baltic peoples folded into the wider project of Latin Christendom, and the local communities, far from disappearing after one battlefield victory, continued to resist, bargain, retreat, and strike. So after Saul, the question was not whether crusading would return. The question was who would command it. In 1237, the surviving Sword Brothers were absorbed into the Teutonic order. On paper, this can sound like a clean institutional solution, almost administrative. One weakened order merged into a stronger one, and the northern mission continued under new discipline. But that language is too tidy for what had actually happened. This was not simply a merger. It was the swallowing of a damaged crusading identity by a more powerful one. The Sword Brothers did not vanish in the sense that every man disappeared. Some survived. Some continued in the region. Their experience, local knowledge, grudges, ambitions, and enemies did not evaporate. What vanished was their separate command, their independent name as the leading military order in Livonia, and their ability to shape the frontier on their own terms. A structure had failed. Another structure took its place. There is an important distinction here. Absorption was not the same as healing. The Teutonic Order could inherit the lands, claims, and military role of the Sword Brothers, but it could not erase the history that came with them. Every earlier campaign had left marks. Every forced submission, every revolt, every burned settlement, every dispute with bishops or local leaders still belonged to the frontier. The Black Cross did not arrive over untouched ground. It arrived over a landscape already thick with consequences. This is why the word erasure sits uncomfortably beside absorption. For the Teutonic Order, the incorporation of the Sword Brothers may have looked like consolidation. A weak and battered crusading force was brought into a larger, better connected institution. Livonia could now be tied more closely to the wider Teutonic system. The Order's prestige could steady a region shaken by defeat. Papal approval could turn crisis into continuity. But from the viewpoint of local peoples, the change may have felt less like reform and more like replacement. One enemy had been broken, only for a stronger one to step into its armor. That is the bitter irony of Saul's aftermath. A victory that shattered the Sword Brothers did not end the crusading pressure. It helped reorganize it. The Baltic resistance had revealed the weakness of one institution, but the Latin Christian world responded by attaching the frontier to an institution with deeper resources and a broader political imagination. The Teutonic Order was not merely larger. It was different. Its experience was wider. Its legal position was stronger. Its ability to attract support from German lands was greater. It had already learned the value of documents, privileges, fortifications, settlement, and long-term administration, where the Sword Brothers had often seemed like an aggressive frontier brotherhood struggling to hold its own place among bishops, towns, and local enemies. The Teutonic Order had the capacity to think in terms of territorial systems. This changed the meaning of the conflict. The Baltic Wars were no longer only a rough crusading frontier with competing authorities. They were becoming part of a more integrated military and political project. Prussia and Livonia, though still separated by resistant lands, could be imagined together as pieces of a northern crusading dominion. That imagination mattered. Before power exists fully on the ground, it often exists in the plans of the people determined to create it. And the Teutonic Order was very good at imagining power as something permanent. Still, we should be cautious not to make the absorption sound inevitable. Nothing in this frontier was inevitable. The Sword Brothers might have collapsed differently. Livonia might have remained more fragmented. Rival authorities might have kept the region divided. The Teutonic Order itself might have failed to turn opportunity into durable control. Medieval politics was full of accidents, bad weather, poor timing, personal rivalries, and decisions made under pressure. But the decision of 1237 gave the Teutonic Knights a northern reach they had not possessed in the same form before. It also gave them problems. The Livonian branch would never be simply a perfect extension of Prussia. Geography resisted that dream. Local politics resisted it. So did Samogitia, lying like a locked gate between the Order's main Prussian territories and its northern possessions. The incorporation created a grander vision, but not an easy one. The Order could now look at the map and see a possible chain of power along the Baltic. Its enemies could look at the same map and see exactly where to break it. That tension would define the next century. The Teutonic Order had absorbed the Sword Brothers, but it had also absorbed their frontier war. The Semi-Gallians, Samogitians, Lithuanians, and other local opponents were not reset by a change in Crusader administration. They did not suddenly become less attached to land, autonomy, or older religious practice because the men across the border now answered to a different master. If anything, the reorganization may have clarified the danger. The struggle was no longer against one troubled order in Livonia. It was against a stronger institution that could link local campaigns to a larger crusading cause. This is where the feud deepened. A feud is not only a sequence of battles, it is a memory system. It teaches each side what to expect from the other. The Order learned that defeat could bring reform and reinforcement. The Baltic peoples learned that victory did not necessarily end invasion. Each side adjusted, each side hardened. In the documents of the crusading world, the absorption of the Sword Brothers could be described as order restored. In the lived experience of the frontier, it was more like a wound being stitched shut with iron thread. The bleeding was controlled, perhaps, but the pain remained underneath. And beneath that pain was a new question. Could the Teutonic Order turn scattered violence into a lasting state? The answer would not be found only on battlefields. It would be found in castle foundations, town charters, tax demands, settlement patterns, and the slow tightening of law around conquered people. The next stage of the story is quieter in some ways, less dramatic than Saul, but more dangerous because it shows how war becomes normal. A battle can kill men in a day. A system can change a country for generations. Conquest becomes more frightening when it stops looking like conquest. At first, it may appear as a raid. Riders cross a border. A village burns. A stronghold falls. A leader is taken hostage or killed. The violence is unmistakable because it announces itself loudly. But a deeper kind of power arrives afterward, quieter and more patient. It measures land. It writes names. It builds mills. It decides which law will judge a quarrel, which language will record a grant, which lord will receive payment, and which castle will watch the road. This was the Teutonic Order's true achievement in the Baltic. Not simply that it fought. Many groups fought. Not simply that it won battles. It also lost battles, sometimes badly. Its deeper strength was that it learned how to turn holy war into administration. In Prussia and Livonia, the Black Cross did not remain only a battlefield sign. It became a governing mark. The castle was the center of that transformation. A Teutonic castle was not just a defensive structure. It was a statement of permanence, built in stone or brick where possible, and supported by timberworks where necessary. It anchored the Order's presence in conquered or contested land. From the outside, it warned local communities that the Crusaders were not merely passing through. From the inside, it allowed the Order to store food, house men, organize patrols, receive messengers, manage prisoners, and prepare the next campaign. The castle made distance shorter. A forest district that once felt remote could be watched from a fortified point. A river crossing could be controlled. A trade route could be taxed. A rebellious community could be reached more quickly. Power no longer had to arrive from far away each season. It could live nearby, behind walls, and walls change behavior. People who might once have waited for an invading force to leave now had to live with a garrison in the neighborhood. Submission became less like a single ceremony and more like a daily condition. Tribute could be demanded again. Labor could be organized. Converts could be monitored. Local elites could be rewarded or replaced. A castle turned conquest from an event into an environment. This is where the Baltic Crusade began to look less like a war for souls and more like the construction of a ruling system. That does not mean the religious language was fake. The brothers of the order understood themselves as men serving a sacred cause. Their prayers, vows, chapels, and liturgy were not decorative. They were part of the inner logic of the institution. But the system they built required earthly machinery. Holiness may have justified expansion, but bricks, grain, law, and money held it together. The order governed through layers of military and administrative discipline. Commanders managed territories. Brothers served in fortified houses. Conquered lands were divided, supervised, and made to produce. German settlers were encouraged or brought into newly controlled areas, founding towns and farming under legal arrangements, familiar to the colonizing world of the German East. Urban centers received privileges. Rural districts were reorganized. The landscape was not only occupied, it was rewritten. This rewriting had consequences that lasted far beyond the first generation of conquest. Settlement brought new languages, laws, and economic expectations. It created loyal communities tied to the order's survival. It also deepened the divide between incoming populations and local peoples who had been defeated, converted, displaced, or subordinated. In some places, older communities were drawn into the new order as laborers, tenants, auxiliaries, or Christian subjects with limited autonomy. In other places, resistance and repression produced sharper ruptures. Conversion was central, but conversion did not mean one simple thing. A person could receive baptism under pressure and still preserve older practices quietly. A leader could accept Christianity to protect his family or rank. A community could submit after devastation and then rebel when conditions changed. From the order's perspective, such reversals confirmed the need for stricter rule. From the local perspective, they may have reflected the difference between outward survival and inward consent. The evidence rarely lets us enter those inner lives clearly. Most of what survives comes from institutions that had reasons to describe submission as legitimate and resistance as betrayal. We do not have equal archives from the Prussian villages that watched castles rise near them. We do not hear the full voices of families deciding whether baptism was faith, strategy, fear, or resignation. What we can see is the structure that surrounded them, and that structure was designed to make older independence increasingly difficult. Law was one of its sharpest instruments. Foreign rule does not depend only on soldiers. It depends on making people answer to new procedures. Who owns this land? Who owes this tax? Who may trade here? Who has the right to judge a dispute? Who can inherit? Who must provide labor? These questions sound ordinary, almost dull, but they are the bones of power. Once the order could define them, It could shape daily life in ways no raiding army could. This is why the Teutonic state feels so modern in its menace, even while being entirely medieval. It did not merely destroy, it organized. It did not only punish, it recorded. It did not only preach, it administered. And because it was a religious military order, its authority carried an unusual moral pressure. To resist the order was not framed merely as resisting a lord. It could be portrayed as resisting Christian order itself. That framing was useful, especially when resistance continued. A rebellion by recently converted Prussians could be described as apostasy. A Lithuanian raid could be presented as pagan aggression. A campaign of expansion could be preached as defense. The order's political needs and spiritual language reinforced each other. When the order needed land, it could speak of mission. When it needed money, it could speak of defense. When it needed prestige, it could invite crusaders to fight on a frontier still presented as sacred. Yet the system was never as smooth as it wanted to appear. The Baltic remained difficult. Castles required supplies. Garrison life was expensive. Settlers needed protection. Local resentment did not vanish because a charter declared new authority. Bishops, towns, nobles, and branches of the order could disagree. The Livonian lands, in particular, remained politically complicated, with multiple powers sharing and contesting influence. The dream of a unified crusader dominion was always being interrupted by geography and human ambition. Still, the order endured because it could absorb friction. It had a corporate memory. A defeat could be studied. A rebellion could be punished. A ruined fortification could be rebuilt stronger. A failed campaign could become justification for another appeal to Western crusaders. This is one of the most important differences between a passing army and an institution. An army can be exhausted. An institution can wait. For conquered peoples, that patience was devastating. The first generation might remember freedom before the castles. The second might remember rebellion. The third might inherit obligations as if they had always existed. This is how conquest tries to become normal, not by convincing everyone, but by outlasting those who remember another arrangement clearly. And yet, the Baltic never became simply obedient. The order could build a state, but it could not fully silence the frontier. Beyond its castles remained peoples and powers who had learned from earlier wars. The Prussians would rise in major rebellion. The Samogitians would continue to block the order's territorial dream. Lithuania would grow into an enemy too large to be treated as a local disturbance. The very system that made the order strong also gave its opponents something clear to resist. A raiding band can vanish into the forest. A state cannot. It has borders, roads, treasury, castles, officials, and ambitions that can be studied, attacked, and remembered. By building permanent power, the Teutonic order made itself formidable. It also made itself impossible to ignore. The crusade had become a state. Now the state would have to face the people who refused to become its subjects. A conquered land is not always a quiet land. The Teutonic order could build castles, divide territories, enforce taxes, and bring in settlers. It could write charters and call upon the authority of pope and emperor. It could bury its violence beneath the language of mission and law. But none of that meant the peoples of the Baltic had accepted the new order in their hearts, or even in their daily lives. Submission on this frontier was often a surface, a palm. Underneath it remained memory, anger, calculation, and the old knowledge that power could be resisted if the moment was chosen carefully. The order learned this repeatedly. A village might appear obedient while its sons disappeared into the forest. A leader might accept baptism and tribute, then wait for a crusader defeat elsewhere. A district might bend during famine or military pressure, only to rise when allies appeared across the border. To the Teutonic knights, these reversals looked like treachery. To the people living under the weight of conquest, they may have looked like breathing. The Prussians, among the first great targets of the order's northern state, did not simply vanish after their lands were invaded. Their resistance stretched across decades, sometimes flaring into major uprisings, sometimes continuing in quieter forms that left fewer traces in the written record. The chronicles often describe rebellion in moral terms, as though the Prussians were breaking a sacred promise by rejecting Christian rule after baptism. But that assumes the promise had been freely made and freely understood. The evidence urges caution. In a world where baptism could be tied to defeat, hostage-taking, tribute, or the presence of armed men, conversion could carry many meanings. Some Prussians may have accepted Christianity sincerely. Others may have accepted it as a survival strategy. Still others may have seen it as a temporary gesture forced upon them by circumstances. When rebellion came, it was not simply a return to old gods. It was also a rejection of domination. That is the human center of this feud. The true conflict was not a romantic rivalry between knightly orders. It was not the Templars in one corner and the Teutonic knights in another, moving like pieces in a medieval game. The Templars belong mostly at the edge of this story. As a comparison, a more famous shadow from another crusading world. Here in the Baltic, the real enemy of the Teutonic order was not another order in white mantles. It was the people whose land the order intended to absorb, and those people did not kneel easily. Samogitians became one of the most persistent symbols of that refusal. Their resistance was not only emotional or religious, it was strategic. By remaining outside firm Teutonic control, they blocked the connection between Prussia and Livonia. They turned geography into defiance. The order could look at Samogitia and see disorder, paganism, and unfinished business. The Samogitians could look back and see the obvious truth. As long as they held, the order's Baltic body remained divided. Lithuanians, meanwhile, changed the scale of resistance. They were not merely defending isolated settlements against crusader raids. Over time, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania became a power that could strike outward, absorb pressure, and participate in the politics of the region with increasing confidence. To the order, Lithuania was infuriating because it refused to remain a simple crusading target. It raided Christian lands, negotiated with Christian rulers, sheltered resistance, and presented itself as a political actor too large to be dismissed as frontier chaos. This was a different kind of enemy. A small rebellion could be crushed and explained away. A great pagan power on the order's border was harder to fit into the triumphal story. Lithuania's survival challenged the idea that the spread of Latin Christian rule in the Baltic was inevitable. It proved that the frontier could produce not only victims and converts, but rivals. That rivalry fed the blood feud. Raids crossed borders, captives were taken, Fortresses were attacked. Villages were burned. Campaigns were preached in the West as holy expeditions, and knights from distant regions came north to fight for status, salvation, adventure, or all three at once. For the local peoples, those same campaigns meant the return of armed strangers into fields and forests already scarred by earlier violence. This is where repetition becomes part of the terror. Not one invasion, but the expectation of another. Not one forced oath, but a system of oaths. Not one burned settlement, but a memory of burned settlements passed through families. Medieval war did not need to be constant to dominate life. It only needed to be likely. The possibility of the next campaign shaped planting, travel, alliance, marriage, and leadership. It pressed itself into ordinary decisions. Resistance was not always heroic in the clean way later stories prefer. Some leaders compromised. Some communities submitted. Some fought their neighbors. Some accepted help from enemies of yesterday. The Baltic peoples were not a single united nation waiting to be born. They were communities with their own rivalries and pressures, and the order knew how to exploit those fractures. That is how conquest often works. It does not defeat everyone at once. It divides, rewards, isolates, and punishes. But the persistence of resistance reveals something the order could not fully control. If conquest had brought only stability, the story would have become administrative. Instead, the frontier kept igniting. The order's castles made rule possible, but they also became targets. Its taxes funded power, but they also provoked resentment. Its Christian mission offered legitimacy, but when joined to coercion, it made faith itself appear as part of foreign domination. This was a dangerous contradiction. A crusading order could demand obedience in the name of salvation, but if the demand arrived with confiscation, forced labor, hostage-taking, and military occupation, then salvation became difficult to separate from subjugation. The order may have believed that harsh measures were necessary to protect new Christians and discipline rebels. Its opponents experienced those measures as the machinery of conquest. Both sides remembered the same events differently. A Teutonic chronicler might see a rebellion crushed and Christian order restored. A local family might remember relatives killed, cattle taken, and children raised under rules imposed by foreigners. A castle commander might record tribute received. A village might remember the tribute as hunger. These different memories did not cancel each other out. They accumulated. That accumulation is what made the feud endure. The order could win territory, but each victory created new obligations. It had to defend what it took. It had to discipline those it ruled. It had to justify campaigns to distant supporters. It had to keep alive the idea that the Baltic remained a sacred frontier, even as its own state became more established, wealthy, and political. The people who resisted forced the order to keep explaining itself. That may be one of the most overlooked forms of resistance. Not every act of defiance wins a battle. Some acts simply prevent the conqueror from declaring the story finished. Prussian rebellions, Samogitian defiance, Lithuanian raids, and local refusals all kept the Baltic from becoming a settled triumph in the order's imagination. The frontier remained unfinished, and because it remained unfinished, the order remained trapped in the logic of holy war. It needed enemies to justify the sword, and the enemies remained. not as faceless pagans in a forest, but as communities trying to preserve choices that conquest had tried to take away. Their world was changed, sometimes permanently. Some were absorbed, some were converted, some were displaced, some disappeared from the political record as distinct powers. But the long refusal mattered. It shaped the order, limited it, exhausted it, and eventually helped create the conditions for larger defeats. The Black Cross could command castles. It could not command memory. And in the Baltic, memory was becoming one of the strongest weapons left to the people who would not kneel. Some places become important because they are rich, others because they are holy. Samogitia became important because it stood in the way. On a map of the medieval Baltic, its meaning becomes almost painfully clear. To the southwest lay the Teutonic Order's Prussian territories, the heart of its growing state. To the north lay Livonia, where the old sword brothers had been absorbed into the Teutonic world. Between them sat Samogitia, wooded, stubborn, difficult to control, and impossible for the order to ignore. It was not the largest land in the region. It was not the wealthiest prize, but it was the hinge on which the order's northern dream kept catching. For the Teutonic Knights, Samogitia was a strategic wound. As long as it remained outside their grasp, Prussia and Livonia could not be joined into a clean territorial body. Messages could pass. Armies could coordinate. Diplomacy could tie the branches together. But the map itself refused to cooperate. Samogitia was the resistant middle, the land that made the Order's Baltic Empire feel incomplete. That incompleteness mattered more than simple pride. A continuous corridor would have made movement easier, defense stronger, administration smoother, and crusading propaganda more convincing. The Order did not only want territory and scattered pieces, it wanted a system. It wanted roads, castles, command, settlement, and lawful authority stretched across the Baltic coast and inland frontiers. Samogitia interrupted that system by existing beyond reliable control. So the region became an obsession. But obsession is not the same as understanding. To the Order, Samogitia could be described as a pagan obstacle, a rebellious zone, a nest of enemies between Christian territories. Such descriptions served a purpose. They made campaigns against it sound necessary, almost defensive. If Samogitia blocked communication between two Christian lands, then conquering it could be presented as restoring order rather than expanding power. This is one of the quiet tricks of frontier language. An invader rarely calls a desired territory someone else's home. It becomes a passage, a gap, a problem, a borderland, a corridor. Once land is described that way, the people living there begin to seem like interference. Their refusal becomes not political independence, but obstruction. For the Samogitians, the meaning was entirely different. They were not a space between Teutonic possessions. They were a people defending their own world. Their land was not an empty hinge on a crusader map. It was a lived landscape of communities, roots, loyalties, fortified places, and sacred memory. The Order saw a missing link. The Samogitians saw the pressure of a machine trying to close around them from both sides, and they learned how to resist that machine. Samogitian resistance endured not because the region was magically unconquerable, and not because its people never suffered defeat. They did. Campaigns devastated land. Political pressure could be intense. Treaties and transfers sometimes placed Samogitia on parchment, as though it could be handed over neatly by rulers making calculations above the heads of the people who lived there. But the gap between diplomatic paper and actual control could be enormous. The order might receive a claim. Holding the land was another matter. Samogitia's terrain helped, but terrain alone does not resist. People resist. Forests and rivers matter when communities know how to use them, when fighters understand the seasons, when local leaders can scatter, regroup, raid, and frustrate occupation. A castle could dominate a district only if it could be supplied, defended, and connected to a wider network. In difficult country, against determined opponents, even a strong castle could become an isolated statement rather than a guarantee of rule. That was the problem the order faced again and again. Samogitia did not need to defeat the Teutonic order everywhere. It needed to prevent the order from making conquest normal. It needed to keep the frontier unstable, to make occupation expensive, to deny the sense of inevitability on which crusading power partly depended. Every failed attempt to swallow the region made the Black Cross look a little less like destiny and a little more like a very determined landlord with a very bad map. There is a human irony here, almost bitter enough to taste. The more the order wanted Samogitia, the more Samogitia's resistance gained meaning. By insisting that this land was essential, the order helped turn it into a symbol. What might have been one region among many became the place where the limits of Teutonic ambition could be seen. To its enemies, Samogitia represented the possibility that the crusading state could be blocked. To the order, it represented unfinished business that could not be allowed to remain unfinished. This is how geography becomes memory. The struggle for Samogitia was tied closely to Lithuania. That connection changed everything. Samogitia was not merely a lonely local resistance surrounded by stronger enemies. It became part of the broader contest between the Teutonic order and the rising Lithuanian state. Lithuanian rulers understood the value of the region. They could use it in diplomacy, defend it when useful, bargain over it when necessary, and return to it as a symbol of legitimacy and resistance. Here again, we have to be careful. Medieval politics was rarely pure. Lithuanian rulers were not always simple protectors acting from modern patriotic feeling. They made hard calculations. Lands could be promised, transferred, contested, and reclaimed. Samogitia could be used as a diplomatic instrument in struggles involving Poland, Lithuania, the Order, and other regional powers. But that political complexity does not erase the local resistance on the ground. It makes the story more layered, because even when elites negotiated, Samogitia still had to be governed in practice. And in practice, it resisted. The Teutonic Order's campaigns against Samogitia fed the wider mythology of the Baltic Crusades. Western knights could be invited to fight on a frontier still described as pagan and dangerous. The order could point to Samogitian defiance as proof that its mission was unfinished. The stubborn survival of non-Teutonic control in the region kept the crusading engine supplied with moral argument. But it also created a trap. The order needed Samogitia to complete its Baltic structure. Yet the repeated inability to secure it exposed the limits of Teutonic power. Each campaign that failed to produce lasting control deepened the problem. Each treaty that promised more than reality delivered made the order seem powerful in writing but frustrated in the field. Each renewal of resistance reminded everyone that the Northern Crusade was not a finished conquest, but a conflict still breathing. The land could not be swallowed because swallowing is not the same as biting. The order could bite. It could raid, burn, pressure, negotiate, and claim. It could win moments. It could impose terms under favorable circumstances, but swallowing meant digestion. It meant making Samogitia part of the order's body, subject to its castles, taxes, roads, law, and Christian administration. That was the harder task. And for generation after generation, Samogitia refused to be digested. This refusal had consequences beyond its borders. It helped keep Prussia and Livonia divided. It strengthened Lithuania's strategic position. It prolonged the justification for crusading war. It drained resources and attention, and perhaps most importantly, it kept alive the knowledge that the Teutonic order, however disciplined and feared, had not solved the Baltic. A powerful state can tolerate many enemies. What it cannot easily tolerate is a permanent reminder of its own incompletion. Samogitia was that reminder. In the order's imagination, it was the missing piece. In Baltic memory, it became something closer to a clenched fist, not untouched, not unscarred, not simple, but still refusing to open on command. And as long as that fist remained closed, the black cross over the Baltic could never rest comfortably on the lands it had already taken. No war lasts this long on one motive alone. That is one of the first things to understand about the Baltic Crusades. If we explain them only as religious wars, we miss the machinery. If we explain them only as land grabs with crosses painted over them, we flatten the minds of medieval people into modern cynicism. The harder truth is that faith and ambition were not always separate forces. They could move through the same man, the same charter, the same campaign, even the same prayer. The Teutonic order lived inside that mixture. Its brothers were religious men by vow. Their world was shaped by liturgy, obedience, penance, and the belief that Christendom had borders worth defending and expanding. To them, pagan Lithuania or resistant Samogitia was not merely foreign. It represented a spiritual disorder on the edge of Christian society. Campaigning there could be imagined as service to God, a defense of converts, a punishment of enemies, and a path toward salvation. But the order also governed land, and land has a way of making ideals heavy. Once the order held Prussia and Livonia, it needed revenue. Castles had to be maintained. Horses had to be fed. Brothers, sergeants, servants, craftsmen, priests, and settlers all depended on systems of supply. Roads and rivers had to be secured. Towns needed privileges. Merchants wanted predictable rules. Farmers needed protection, but also became sources of taxation and labor. A crusading state could speak in the language of heaven, but it still had to balance accounts on earth. This is where the sword met the ledger. Trade mattered deeply in the Baltic. The region was tied to routes carrying wax, furs, timber, grain, fish, amber, and other goods that connected local economies to wider European markets. River mouths and ports were not just convenient places on a map. They were arteries of wealth. Control over them brought tolls, influence, and leverage. A castle near a river crossing was a military position, but it was also an economic instrument. The order understood this. It did not build power by fighting in isolation. It built power by linking war to settlement, settlement to taxation, taxation to fortification, and fortification to further war. This cycle could be justified as necessary for Christian defense, and sometimes, from the order's point of view, it really was defensive. A newly conquered district might revolt. A Lithuanian raid might devastate a border region. A castle might genuinely protect settlers and converts from attack. Yet the same defensive argument could also excuse expansion. That is the old frontier problem. The conqueror says, "We must advance to make ourselves safe. The people beyond the line here, you are next." Every new fortress creates a new border. Every new border creates a new insecurity. Every insecurity can be used to justify another campaign. In this way, the order's state became trapped in a logic that was both strategic and spiritual. It needed to expand because it was threatened. It was threatened because it expanded. Prestige added another layer. For nobles from Western and Central Europe, the Baltic offered a crusading theater at a time when the old Eastern crusading world had become more difficult and uncertain. A journey to fight, alongside the Teutonic order, could bring honor, religious merit, and stories worth carrying home. The North became a place where aristocratic violence could be disciplined into a sacred frame. Men who might otherwise feud with neighbors or chase local glory could instead ride against Lithuania or Samogitia under the banner of holy war. This does not mean every visiting crusader was a hypocrite. Medieval piety could be sincere and martial at the same time. A knight might believe he was serving God, protecting Christians, gaining honor, and proving himself before his peers, all without seeing contradiction. The modern desire to separate motives into clean categories would have seemed strange to him. Faith, status, fear, obedience, and hunger for reputation could live comfortably in the same saddle. But for those on the receiving end, mixed motives did not soften the blow. A Samogitian village did not experience a raid differently because the man carrying fire had a complicated inner life. A Lithuanian frontier settlement did not become less burned because the campaign had papal approval. A Prussian family did not owe taxes more gently because the order saw itself as a guardian of souls. Motive matters for interpretation, but experience matters for memory. And memory often records what power did, not what power claimed to intend. The order's need to justify itself became more urgent as the region changed. This is one of the most interesting contradictions in the Baltic Crusades. The more the order succeeded in building a Christian state, the more it needed remaining enemies to preserve its crusading purpose. A military order built for holy war cannot easily become just another landlord without raising uncomfortable questions. If the frontier becomes peaceful, what exactly is the sword for? Lithuania and Samogitia provided an answer. Their resistance allowed the order to continue presenting the Baltic as an unfinished sacred battlefield. Campaigns could be preached. Donations could be encouraged. Visiting knights could be welcomed. Defeats could be explained as trials. Victories could be celebrated as signs that the mission remained alive. The enemy was not only a threat to the order's borders, the enemy was part of the order's identity. That does not make the threat imaginary. Lithuanian power was real. Raids were real. Political danger was real. The order did not invent all its fears, but it did shape those fears into a story that served its survival. Lithuania was not described merely as a neighboring power with its own interests. It was framed as a pagan menace, a spiritual and military danger whose existence justified continued war. This framing made diplomacy difficult, though never impossible, because treating the enemy as fully political risked weakening the sacred clarity of the crusade. Still, politics kept intruding. The order negotiated when useful. Lithuanian rulers negotiated when useful. Christian powers fought one another despite their shared faith. Alliances crossed moral lines that preachers preferred not to emphasize. Trade could continue near war zones. Captives could be exchanged. Treaties could be signed and broken. The Baltic was never a clean battlefield between belief and unbelief. It was a living region where practical necessity constantly complicated ideology. That is why the phrase "holy war" needs careful handling. It was holy in the minds of many who fought it. It was also political in its structures, economic in its rewards, and colonial in its effects. It brought churches, but also castles. It brought baptism, but also tribute. It brought new towns and laws, but also dispossession. It drew distant knights seeking salvation, but left local people to live with the consequences long after those knights rode home. The sword did not travel alone. It carried sermons, contracts, debts, ambitions, fears, and memories. It opened space for merchants and settlers. It protected priests and tax collectors. It punished rebellion and called punishment justice. It could be raised in prayer and then used to secure a grain route before winter. This is what makes the Baltic conflict so difficult to reduce to a single moral slogan. It was not fake religion. It was not pure economics. It was not only German expansion, only papal strategy, only noble adventure, only local resistance, only cultural destruction. It was all of these braided together so tightly that pulling one strand loose can distort the whole pattern. But if we are looking for the heart of the feud, one fact remains steady. The Teutonic order wanted to make the Baltic frontier serve its vision of Christian rule. The Baltic peoples who resisted wanted to prevent their worlds from being remade without consent. Everything else, the trade, the taxes, the indulgences, the castles, the treaties, the noble guests, the sermons, gathered around that central pressure. Faith gave the war meaning. Trade gave it value. The sword gave it form. And together, they made a frontier where almost every act of violence could be explained as necessity by the people committing it, and remembered as invasion by the people enduring it. At first, Lithuania could be described by the Crusaders as a target. That was the convenient category. A pagan land, a frontier beyond the reach of Latin Christian rule, a place to raid, punish, convert, pressure, and eventually bring into the orbit of the cross. For the Teutonic order, this was a familiar mental map. The frontier had enemies. Enemies could be named. Once named, they could be preached against. But Lithuania did not remain in the category assigned to it. Over time, it became something more dangerous. A state capable of surviving the crusade, learning from it, and turning pressure back on the men who had tried to define it as prey. This shift is one of the central turns in the Baltic story. The Teutonic order did not merely face scattered local resistance. It faced a political power that grew large enough to make the crusading narrative feel unstable. Lithuania's strength did not come from one simple source. It came from leadership, geography, military adaptation, diplomacy, and the ability to operate across cultural borders. Lithuanian rulers could draw on pagan legitimacy at home while negotiating with Christian neighbors when necessary. They could raid deeply, retreat quickly, absorb displaced peoples, and exploit the rivalries of surrounding powers. They did not need to match the Order castle for castle in order to threaten it. They needed mobility, timing, alliances, and endurance. The Teutonic Order understood fortification. Lithuania understood space. That contrast shaped the war. The Order's power was heavy, organized, and institutional. It built places meant to last. Lithuania's power could be more fluid. It could appear along a frontier, devastate a district, take captives, avoid decisive defeat, and return through terrain where pursuit was costly. This does not mean Lithuania had no centers of authority or no structure. It means that against the Order, its strength often lay in refusing to fight on the Order's preferred terms. For a crusading state, this was maddening. The Order could present Lithuania as a pagan menace, and there was real violence to point to. Lithuanian raids were feared, destructive, and politically significant. Border communities suffered. Captives were taken. Fortified lines were tested. The Order's lands could not feel secure while Lithuania remained powerful beyond them. Yet the Order's own campaigns into Lithuanian territory produced the same kind of suffering in reverse. This is one reason the moral language of the conflict becomes so strained. Each side could describe itself as responding to the violence of the other. The Order claimed to defend Christians and converts from pagan attack. Lithuanians and their allies experienced Teutonic campaigns as invasion, devastation, and an attempt to force their land into a foreign religious and political system. Both sides could point to burned places. Both sides could remember captives. But the Order possessed a crusading ideology that transformed its violence into sacred duty. Lithuania's survival challenged that ideology. If the Teutonic War was divinely favored, why did Lithuania continue to stand? If pagan rule was supposed to crumble before Christian arms, why did this pagan power grow? If the frontier was moving steadily toward conversion under Teutonic leadership, why did the Order keep needing new campaigns, new reinforcements, new explanations? These were not necessarily questions the Order asked aloud. Institutions are skilled at protecting their own stories. But the problem was visible. Lithuania forced the Order to live in a permanent contradiction. It claimed to be the spear of Christian victory in the Baltic, yet its greatest enemy refused to be conquered. That refusal gave Lithuania diplomatic weight. The Grand Duchy could maneuver among stronger and weaker neighbors, sometimes fighting, sometimes negotiating, sometimes using the possibility of conversion as a political instrument. In medieval Europe, baptism was not only a matter of faith. For rulers, it could open alliances, change legitimacy, and alter the terms by which enemies justified war. Lithuania's eventual Christianization would become one of the great strategic disruptions in the region, because it threatened to remove the very religious argument on which the Order depended. But before that moment could fully reshape the conflict, Lithuania had already become the nightmare. Not because it was invincible. It was not. not because its rulers were morally pure defenders of freedom. They were medieval rulers, capable of expansion, coercion, and violence in their own right. Lithuania became the nightmare because it refused the role of passive victim. It took the crusading frontier and made it reciprocal. The hunters were now watched. The raiders were now raided. The order that had tried to export fear into the forests found fear returning across its own borders. This altered the psychology of the Baltic War. For Prussians and Samogitians resisting Teutonic power, Lithuania could serve as refuge, ally, or strategic partner. For the Order, it was the great unresolved danger behind many smaller crises. A Prussian rebellion might be local, but if Lithuania supported or benefited from it, the rebellion became part of a wider struggle. Samogitia's resistance was difficult enough on its own, but tied to Lithuania, it became far more serious. The frontier was no longer a line between order and disorder. It was a zone where a rival power could shape events, and the Order's need to destroy or contain that rival only grew. Western crusaders continued to come north, drawn by preaching, prestige, and the chance to fight on a frontier still marketed as sacred. Lithuania became a stage on which European nobles could perform holy violence without traveling to the far eastern Mediterranean. That was useful for the Order. It kept attention and resources flowing. But it also meant Lithuania's very existence became part of the Order's public identity. The enemy was not only fought, the enemy was advertised. There is a danger in advertising your enemy too well. You make them larger in the imagination. You teach others to measure your success by whether that enemy still stands. Each year, Lithuania remained unconquered. It became a living rebuke to Teutonic certainty. Each failed campaign, each winter raid that did not break Lithuanian power, each treaty that settled less than it promised, added to the sense that the Order had met something it could wound but not master. The rise of Lithuania also complicates the idea of Christian Europe expanding smoothly eastward. The medieval Baltic was not a simple frontier where one civilization advanced and another receded. It was a competitive political world. Lithuania absorbed Ruthenian lands, engaged with Orthodox populations, negotiated with Catholic powers, and built a multi-ethnic state while still being treated by the Order as the pagan enemy par excellence. That complexity made Teutonic propaganda both powerful and incomplete. It could call Lithuania pagan, but it could not make Lithuania simple, and simple enemies are easier to conquer in the mind. Real ones negotiate, adapt, and survive. By the late medieval period, the Teutonic Order was not merely fighting to convert Lithuania. It was fighting to preserve the meaning of its own existence. A powerful Lithuania threatened the Order militarily. Diplomatically flexible, Lithuania threatened it ideologically. A Christianizing Lithuania would threaten it even more, because a crusading order needs a crusading frontier. Without one, its castles begin to look less like guardians of the faith, and more like possessions in need of excuses. That future was approaching, though not yet resolved. For now, Lithuania stood as the northern nightmare, too near to ignore, too strong to crush easily, too politically skilled to dismiss, and too useful as an enemy for the Order to stop invoking it. The feud had changed. It was no longer only the story of crusaders forcing their way into fragmented Baltic lands. It was now a struggle between the Teutonic state and a rising power that could answer in kind. The Black Cross had found an enemy that could stare back across the border, and it did not look away. The most dangerous wars are not always the ones fought with the largest armies. Sometimes they are the wars that learn how to explain themselves. The Teutonic Order did not describe its Baltic campaigns as ordinary conquest. It did not present itself as a hungry state, pushing into neighboring lands, because land was useful, trade was profitable, and castles made rulers powerful. It spoke in a higher language. It spoke of defending Christians, rescuing souls, punishing pagan aggression, and extending the borders of the faith. That language mattered. It turned violence into duty. It made distant supporters feel connected to the frontier. It allowed noblemen from far away to imagine a raid into Lithuania not as a political expedition, but as an act of sacred service. It helped the order turn a regional war into something larger, something that could be preached, funded, celebrated, and remembered as part of the Christian struggle against unbelief. But a holy explanation does not make a war holy to the people being invaded. To Prussians, Samogitians, Lithuanians, and others caught in the path of the order's campaigns, the experience was not likely to feel like rescue. It could mean fields destroyed before harvest, relatives taken captive, leaders pressured into submission, sacred places threatened, tribute demanded, and foreign law creeping closer behind the protection of stone walls. The order may have imagined itself as a surgeon cutting out pagan error. Those under the knife could be forgiven for noticing the blade more than the cure. This is the central fracture in the Baltic feud. The same campaign could be remembered in two completely different moral languages. In a Crusader chronicle, it might appear as righteous punishment against pagans who had rejected truth or attacked Christians. In local memory, if it survived outside the written sources at all, it may have been remembered as devastation by outsiders whose God arrived with fire, horses, and demands. One side called it correction. The other could experience it as violation. The historian has to stand carefully between these voices. Most surviving written accounts were produced by literate Christian institutions. They tell us a great deal, but they also tell us from a position of power. They preserve the order's explanations more clearly than the grief of the people it fought. That does not mean every Crusader source is useless or dishonest. It means the sources were shaped by purpose. They defended a worldview. They justified losses. They turned victories into proof. They made enemies legible to readers who already believed pagan resistance was a problem to be solved. So when the order's enemies appear as faithless, treacherous, savage, or stubborn, we should listen for what is being hidden inside those words. Treacherous might mean a community rebelled after forced submission. Stubborn might mean a people refused to abandon its autonomy. Savage might mean the chronicler did not recognize, or did not wish to recognize, the political logic of the enemy. And pagan could be both a religious description and a political weapon. That last point is essential. In the Baltic, paganism was not merely a theological category. It became a justification for war. As long as Lithuania and Samogitia remained outside Latin Christianity, the order could describe them as legitimate targets of crusade. Their spiritual status made their political independence vulnerable. They were not just neighbors, they were unfinished business. This is where holy war became a kind of blood feud. A blood feud is sustained by injury and retaliation, but also by stories that explain why retaliation is necessary. The Order had its stories. It could point to raids, killed Christians, broken agreements, and attacks on converted lands. Its enemies had theirs: invasions, coercion, tribute, destroyed settlements, and the steady advance of foreign control. Each side could remember wounds. Each side could claim it was answering violence rather than beginning it. Over time, the first cause mattered less than the accumulated memory. A raid answered a raid. A punitive campaign answered a rebellion. A rebellion answered oppression. A castle answered insecurity. An attack on the castle answered the castle's existence. The chain lengthened until the war seemed to justify itself simply by continuing. Children inherited a conflict whose opening grievance they had never seen. By then, holiness did not end the feud. It preserved it. The Teutonic Order's sacred framing also protected it from certain criticisms. If the war was for Christian truth, then harshness could be explained as discipline. If resistance was rebellion against God's order, then punishment could be interpreted as justice. If conquered peoples returned to older practices after baptism, then the problem was not coercion, but apostasy. This language did not merely describe events. It shaped what actions seemed permissible. It also made compromise more difficult. Political enemies can be bargained with. Spiritual enemies can be bargained with too, of course, and medieval rulers did it constantly. But the public language becomes tighter. If your enemy is not merely a rival, but a symbol of unbelief, every treaty risks looking like weakness. Every concession must be explained. Every failed campaign requires a moral interpretation. The Order could negotiate with Lithuania, but it also needed Lithuania to remain the kind of enemy that justified the Order's existence. That need became more uncomfortable as Lithuania grew stronger and more diplomatically sophisticated. A small pagan district could be described as a mission field. A great political power could not be reduced so easily, though the Order often tried. Lithuania dealt with Christian neighbors, ruled over Christian populations in some territories, and played the politics of the region with skill. It did not fit neatly into the role of ignorant darkness waiting for baptism. The Teutonic Order's holy narrative had to work harder to contain it. And when Lithuania eventually moved toward Christianization, the problem sharpened. If the great pagan enemy accepted Christianity, what became of the crusade? What became of the Order's reason for war? The question did not instantly dissolve the conflict, because politics, territory, and old grievances remained. But it exposed something that had always been true. Religion was central to the war's language, yet the war had grown roots in land, power, and institutional survival. A feud made holy does not automatically end when one side changes its prayers. That is one of the darker lessons of this story. Sacred language can begin by explaining violence, then become attached to interests that no longer depend entirely on the original cause. Castles do not vanish when enemies are baptized. Debts do not vanish. Territorial claims do not vanish. Men who have spent their lives fighting do not easily accept that the moral world has shifted beneath their feet. The Baltic peoples understood the cost of that delay. For them, the Order's holy war meant that their resistance could be condemned not only as political defiance, but as spiritual failure. Their gods and customs were not treated as the traditions of a people with their own history, but as errors to be removed. Their independence was not simply inconvenient, it was cast as dangerous to Christian order. That made cultural survival part of the battlefield. And yet, cultures rarely disappear exactly when conquerors expect them to. They bend, hide, merge, return in altered forms, or survive in memory after institutions have changed. Forced conversion could produce Christians, but not always obedience. Military defeat could produce tribute, but not affection. New law could reshape public life, while older loyalties remained in private places where chroniclers could not easily see. This is why the Baltic feud cannot be understood only through treaties and battles. Its deepest violence lay in the attempt to define reality itself. The order claimed the authority to name the war, name the enemy, name the meaning of resistance, and name the future of the land. The people who resisted fought not only against soldiers, but against being described out of their own story. That struggle over meaning outlived many of the men who fought. In the end, the Teutonic Order succeeded in making its feud holy in the eyes of much of Latin Christendom. But holiness, once attached to conquest, carries a shadow. It can elevate sacrifice, but it can also hide ambition. It can inspire courage, but it can also make cruelty feel clean. It can turn a border war into the moral drama where the people losing their land are cast as obstacles to salvation. The Black Cross over the Baltic was never only a symbol of faith. It was also a claim about who had the right to rule, to remember, and to decide what counted as civilization. And the peoples facing it knew, long before the chroniclers admitted it, that a sacred banner could still cast a very earthly shadow. For almost 2 centuries, the Teutonic Order had worked to make itself seem permanent. Its castles stood like arguments in brick and stone. Its banners carried the Black Cross across the Baltic frontier. Its chronicles gave the conflict a sacred shape. Its diplomats defended its claims in the language of law. Its armies drew crusading guests from distant lands, men eager to prove themselves in the cold theater of the North. The Order had suffered defeats before. It had endured rebellions, ambushes, failed campaigns, and the humiliating memory of earlier disasters like Saul. But it had also survived them. That survival was part of its power. The Teutonic Knights had become very good at turning setbacks into reasons for further war. Then came 1410. The Battle of Grunwald, known also through other names in different traditions, was not simply another clash on a long border. It was the moment when the old aura cracked in public. On one side stood the Teutonic Order, commanded by Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen. On the other stood the combined forces of Poland and Lithuania, led by King Władysław Jagiełło of Poland and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania. The names matter because they show what the conflict had become. This was no longer a campaign against isolated pagan districts, no longer a punitive raid into a forest frontier, no longer the old crusading story in its cleanest form. Lithuania had entered a new political and religious reality. Poland and Lithuania were now tied together in a way that transformed the balance of power. The Order was not facing a scattered enemy beyond the edge of Christendom. It was facing a coalition strong enough to meet it in the open and dangerous enough to destroy its confidence. That was the nightmare made visible. The road to Grunwald was paved with older grievances, especially around Samogitia. That land, the stubborn hinge between Prussia and Livonia, remained at the center of the dispute. Treaties had tried to settle it. Political agreements had claimed to transfer or define it. But Samogitia had never been merely an item on parchment. It was land, people, strategy, memory, and humiliation. For the Order, it remained unfinished business. For Lithuania, it remained a vital proof that Teutonic ambition could be resisted. By 1410, the feud had become too large to contain in frontier raids. The battlefield brought together not only armies, but interpretations of history. The Teutonic Order still carried the prestige of a crusading institution, but its moral position had become less simple than it once claimed. Its great Lithuanian enemy was no longer easily presented as a pagan darkness waiting beyond Christian borders. The old religious argument had weakened, while territorial conflict remained. That is a dangerous moment for any institution built on sacred war, when the sacred justification fades faster than the appetite for power. Grunwald exposed that tension with steel. The battle itself was vast by medieval regional standards, though exact numbers in later accounts should be treated carefully. Medieval chroniclers and later national traditions often enlarged armies to match the emotional size of the event. What matters more than precise totals is the result. The Teutonic army was defeated. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen was killed. Many leading brothers and commanders died with him. The Order's military elite suffered a blow from which its prestige never fully recovered. This was not just a loss, it was a shattering of image. A military order depends on more than men and horses. It depends on belief. Belief among supporters that it is favored, effective, worth funding, worth joining, worth fearing. For generations, the Teutonic Order had cultivated the image of disciplined inevitability. It could be delayed, resisted, even wounded, but it remained the great armed instrument of Christian order in the Baltic. At Grunwald, that image lay among the dead. The Polish-Lithuanian victory did not erase the order overnight. This is important. History rarely gives us endings as clean as legends do. The Teutonic state did not vanish the day after the battle. Its castles still stood. Its administrators still worked. Its surviving brothers still defended what remained. The victors did not simply walk across Prussia and dissolve the order like frost under morning sun, but the meaning of the order changed. Before Grunwald, the Teutonic Knights could still present themselves as a feared frontier power whose setbacks did not disturb the larger pattern of expansion and control. After Grunwald, they had to live with proof that the pattern had broken. The Black Cross could be defeated not by a temporary uprising alone, but by a major political coalition capable of meeting the order's strength directly. For Poland and Lithuania, the victory carried enormous symbolic force. It showed that the order's military reputation could be punctured. It confirmed the power of the Polish-Lithuanian partnership. It gave Lithuania, once treated as the crusading frontier's great pagan enemy, a decisive place in the downfall of the very institution that had defined itself against it. There is a deep reversal here. The order had spent generations trying to turn Lithuania into a mission field, a target, a problem to be solved. At Grunwald, Lithuania helped become the solution to the order. That does not mean the victors were saints in a morality play. Medieval politics did not suddenly become gentle because the Teutonic Order lost. Poland and Lithuania had ambitions of their own. Victory brought opportunity, bargaining, and the hard work of turning battlefield success into political gain. But the symbolic balance had changed. The order could no longer command the same fear. Its enemies had seen it fall, and memories of falling matter. Think back to Saul. There, the sword brothers had been broken, and a stronger crusading structure emerged from the wreckage. Grunwald was different. This time, there was no larger brotherhood waiting in the wings to absorb the damage and restore the old confidence. The Teutonic order itself was the great structure. When it cracked, the crack ran through the center. Its enemies understood that. So did its subjects, creditors, rivals, and uneasy neighbors. A defeated power is not only weakened by what it loses on the battlefield, it is weakened because everyone begins recalculating. Towns ask whether obedience is still safe. Opponents ask whether pressure might now work. Allies ask whether support is still worth the cost. Lenders ask whether debts can be paid. The political world starts listening for weakness in every official statement. Grunwald made that weakness audible. The battle also marked a transformation in memory. For later Polish and Lithuanian histories, it became more than a medieval victory. It became a symbol of resistance against German military religious expansion. A moment when a long northern pressure was answered decisively. Like all such symbols, it would be reshaped by later centuries, sometimes simplified, sometimes used for purposes the people of 1410 could not have imagined. But the reason it could carry so much later meaning is that the original event was already enormous. It was the day the order's story stopped sounding inevitable. The Black Cross did not disappear from the Baltic sky. It remained painted on shields, sewn onto mantles, stamped into documents, guarded behind walls. But after Grunwald, it no longer looked quite the same. The symbol that once suggested holy discipline and unstoppable frontier rule now carried the memory of a field where its greatest champions had fallen. There is a quiet lesson in that. Institutions often survive the moment when their legend dies. They continue working. They issue orders. They negotiate. They collect revenue. They insist that nothing essential has changed. But people remember the day they saw the legend bleed. For the Teutonic Order, Grunwald was that day. The feud did not end there. The Baltic struggle would continue in treaties, debts, political retreat, and arguments over memory. But after 1410, the Order was no longer writing the story from a position of unquestioned strength. The Black Cross had not been erased. It had been broken in the eyes of the world. A battlefield victory can happen in a single day. Its consequences take longer to reveal themselves. After Grunwald, the Teutonic Order still existed. That fact matters, because memory often prefers cleaner endings than history provides. It would be satisfying, in a dramatic way, to imagine the Black Cross falling once and never rising again. But the Order did not vanish into the grass of the battlefield. Its castles remained. Its officials continued their work. Its archives, revenues, and territorial claims did not burn away simply because its army had been defeated. Yet something essential had changed. The Order survived, but it no longer stood in the same light. Before Grunwald, the Teutonic Knights could still lean on an old image of disciplined strength. They had enemies, yes. They had suffered setbacks, yes. but they remained one of the great military powers of the Baltic, a religious order that had turned crusade into government, and government into a kind of armed permanence. After 1410, that permanence looked less certain, not destroyed, but exposed. The difference may sound small. It was not. Medieval power depended heavily on reputation. A castle wall is useful because it is strong, but also because people believe it is worth fearing. A military order attracts support because it wins, but also because distant nobles, donors, and allies believe their support joins them to something favored and effective. Once that belief begins to weaken, every practical problem becomes more dangerous. And the order had many practical problems. The defeat at Grunwald cost lives, leadership, and confidence. It also intensified financial pressure. War was expensive, even in victory. In defeat, it could become suffocating. Fortifications had to be maintained. Mercenaries, allies, and retainers required payment. Diplomacy demanded gifts, negotiations, and concessions. A ruling system built by war now had to pay the price of war while its enemies watched for weakness. This is one of the less romantic but most decisive truths of the aftermath. Decline often begins not with a single collapse, but with accounts that no longer balance easily. The Teutonic state had been built on a cycle of conquest, taxation, settlement, crusading prestige, and political justification. Grunwald damaged that cycle. It did not stop everything at once, but it made everything harder. The order still held territory, but holding territory after a major defeat is different from holding it under the aura of invincibility. Subjects become less certain. Rivals become more patient. Enemies become bolder. Allies become more expensive. The political retreat was gradual, uneven, and contested. The order negotiated, defended, maneuvered, and tried to preserve as much authority as possible. Its leaders did not simply accept decline as a tragic destiny. Institutions rarely do. They adapt, argue, reform, blame, borrow, and insist that recovery is possible. In the years after Grunwald, the order remained a serious actor in Baltic politics. But the direction of the story had shifted. It was no longer expanding with the same confidence. It was increasingly trying to protect a position that had become vulnerable. That vulnerability changed how others spoke about it. For Poland and Lithuania, Grunwald became a victory larger than its immediate military results. It was proof that the Teutonic Order could be defeated by a coalition it had long underestimated or misrepresented. It gave later generations a powerful scene to remember. The proud crusading order broken before forces that included the descendants of those it had once cast as targets of holy war. Of course, later memory is never innocent. Over the centuries, Grunwald would be reinterpreted again and again. It would become part of national histories, political myth-making, patriotic art, and arguments about identity. Polish memory, Lithuanian memory, German memory, and broader European interpretations did not always tell the same story. Each tradition found different meanings in the same field. For some, it was liberation. For others, catastrophe. For others still, a symbol to be used in struggles far removed from the medieval world that produced it. This does not make the memory false. It makes it powerful. Historical events become legends when they can carry more than their original weight. Grunwald carried the weight of war, religion, ethnicity, state power, resistance, and the long shadow of German expansion into the east. Later centuries would sometimes simplify the medieval conflict into a cleaner confrontation than it really was. The Teutonic Order could become a symbol of foreign oppression. Poland and Lithuania could become symbols of heroic unity. The Baltic peoples could be folded into national stories that did not always preserve their older complexity. That is the danger of a legend. It remembers intensely, but not always carefully. The real aftermath of Grunwald was not a single triumphal march into justice. It was political pressure, negotiation, debt, territorial bargaining, and the slow erosion of Teutonic dominance. The Order's enemies still had to convert victory into durable advantage. The Order still had resources and walls. Medieval conflicts rarely reward one side with everything it wants. They leave behind documents, grudges, unpaid soldiers, contested borders, and men who believe the next campaign might repair the last. But even when politics remained messy, the symbolic defeat was irreversible. The Teutonic Knights had spent generations presenting themselves as the guardians of a sacred frontier. After Grunwald, that claim could still be made, but it no longer rang with the same authority. The great enemy had not been crushed. Lithuania had not disappeared. Samogitia had not been swallowed into a seamless Teutonic corridor. Poland had not been intimidated into silence. The Order's old story had met a reality too large to absorb, and still, the legend of the Order survived too. That is another irony. Defeat weakened the Teutonic Knights as a political power, but it did not erase their fascination. The image of the Black Cross endured because it held contradictions that later imaginations could not resist. Monks with swords, castles in the northern mist. Holy war turned into bureaucracy. Crusaders who became rulers. Rulers who became debtors. A feared order whose greatest defeat became more famous than many of its victories. The Templars, with their dramatic suppression and later myths, would become the more famous military order in popular imagination. But in the Baltic, the Teutonic legacy was more concrete. It remained in towns, borders, legal traditions, ruins, chronicles, and the memory of conquest. The Order did not need hidden treasure or secret rituals to matter. Its real history was strange enough. A religious brotherhood building a state on a crusading frontier, then watching that state slowly lose the certainty that had once sustained it. After Grunwald, the Baltic feud did not disappear. It changed form. The battlefield gave way to diplomacy, pressure, financial strain, and the slow rebalancing of regional power. The Order still fought to preserve its interests, but the age of unquestioned Teutonic expansion had passed. The Black Cross remained visible, but now it carried a second meaning. It no longer signified only holy authority and military discipline. It also signified the memory of limits. That is why the aftermath matters. The story is not just that the Teutonic Order was defeated. Many armies are defeated. The deeper point is that its defeat weakened the story it had told about itself. For centuries, the Order had tried to define the Baltic frontier. Who belonged, who resisted, who needed conversion, who had the right to rule. After Grunwald, others increasingly claimed the power to define that history. And once an institution loses control of its own legend, decline has already entered the room, not always loudly. Sometimes it comes as debt, as negotiation, as a treaty signed with clenched teeth, as a town calculating its future, as an enemy remembering that the impossible has already happened once. The battle ended. The legend remained the legend. But now the legend belonged to more than the men who wore the cross. So the title has to be understood carefully. This was not, at its heart, a war between the Templars and the Teutonic order. The Templars belonged to the wider world of crusading orders, and their fame often pulls attention towards them like a bright object in a dark room. They are useful as a comparison, another brotherhood of armed monks, another institution born from the crusading age, another symbol later wrapped in myth. But the Baltic story belongs elsewhere. Its center is not a secret rivalry between orders. It is the long, violent feud between the Teutonic order and the peoples of the northern frontier it tried to conquer. Prussians, Livonians, Semi-Gallians, Samogitians, Lithuanians, and others whose lives were caught in the pressure of holy war made permanent. That distinction changes everything. If we make the story about the Templars, we drift into familiar legend. If we keep our eyes on the Baltic, we see something harsher and more historically important. A crusade without Jerusalem, a religious war that became a state, a frontier where conversion, colonization, trade, taxation, and military discipline were braided into one system of rule. The Teutonic order did not merely ride north and fight. It built. It built castles where power could sleep safely behind walls. It built towns and legal structures. It built claims on parchment and defended them with steel. It built a language in which expansion could sound like salvation. And against that construction stood people who understood that surrender could mean more than losing a battle. It could mean losing the right to define their own land, their own gods, their own obligations, and their own memory. The Baltic peoples did not resist in one perfect, unified, romantic wave. They argued, adapted, converted, rebelled, negotiated, and sometimes fought one another. Their world was not simple, but their resistance mattered because it prevented the order's story from becoming as smooth as the order wanted it to be. Prussian uprisings, Samogitian stubbornness, Lithuanian statecraft, and countless local refusals turned the Baltic into a frontier that would not quietly become a Teutonic possession. That is the forgotten blood feud. Not one battle, not one villain, not one clean line between faith and politics. A feud made of raids, treaties, baptisms, castles, burned fields, broken promises, strategic marriages, winter marches, and memories that outlived the men who made them. Grunwald broke the aura of the Black Cross, but it did not erase the past that had raised it. The order's decline came slowly, through pressure, debt, diplomacy, and the changing shape of power in northeastern Europe. Yet the deeper reckoning was already visible. The institution that had tried to define the Baltic as a sacred frontier had become part of the region's contested memory. And memory is never neutral. For some, the Teutonic Knights remained disciplined crusaders, defenders of Christian order in a dangerous land. For others, they were invaders who arrived with prayers on their lips and administration in their saddlebags. Both images contain pieces of the past, but neither is enough alone. The real history lives in the tension between them. That is why this story still matters. It reminds us that conquest often survives by naming itself something nobler. It reminds us that religious conviction and political ambition can be sincere at the same time, and dangerous for exactly that reason. It reminds us that people written as obstacles in one archive may have been defenders of home in another memory that was never allowed to become an archive at all. The Black Cross over the Baltic was not only a symbol painted on shields. It was a question forced upon a region. Who has the right to rule, to convert, to tax, to remember, and to call the result civilization? The answer was never settled by one battle, or one charter, or one crusading sermon. It was fought over for generations in forests, marshes, towns, castles, and chronicles. And perhaps the most honest ending is this: the Teutonic Order won many lands, but it never fully conquered the meaning of the struggle. The Baltic kept its scars, and through those scars, the forgotten feud still speaks.